They laughed when I backed a livestock trailer full of 2,000 live tilapia up to my irrigation ditches instead of spreading the fertilizer my neighbors used. That was March of 2022, on 340 acres in the Willow Creek Valley, 6 months after I buried my grandfather, and 4 days after a man in $700 boots told me my land was worth $2.1 million, and I had 90 days to sign. Tell me where you're watching this from, and if you've ever had someone stand on land that isn't theirs and tell you what it's worth, hit like, subscribe, and stay, because they were wrong about all of it. 90 days. That was the clock Dale Caldwell set the first time he stepped out of his truck onto my grandfather's dirt, and it's the clock that hangs over everything I'm about to tell you. Because Meridian AgroWorks doesn't wait for grief, and it doesn't wait for harvest. It waits for signatures. The second clock started 3 weeks earlier, in the feed store in town, when Roy Fenwick, the county extension agent, told 4 other ranchers within earshot that I was going to poison my own soil with fish guts, and laughed loud enough that I heard it through the screen door. The third clock is the one I didn't know was ticking yet, the one that ends with every one of them standing in a gravel lot outside the grain co-op, reading numbers off a chalkboard that I wrote myself, in my grandfather's handwriting, because I never learned to write any other way. My grandfather, Elias Whitfield, farmed this valley for 51 years before a stroke took him in October of 2021, on a Tuesday, in the seat of the same Ford tractor he bought in 1987. I found him with his hand still resting on the gear shift, and the wheat behind him standing at 4.5 feet, the tallest stand the valley had seen in a decade. He left me the deed. He left me 41 head of cattle, and he left me 11 leather-bound ledgers going back to 1974, every page filled with his handwriting, never a feeling in any of them, never a single line about missing my grandmother, who died in 1998, only what the soil did, what the water did, what the cattle did, and when. Land doesn't lie to you, he used to say, standing at the fence line with his hat pushed back, but it doesn't repeat itself either. You have to be there, the one time it tells you something. I heard that sentence maybe 200 times growing up on this place, summers and school breaks, before I left for 11 years to work water rights litigation in Boise. I came back for the funeral and I never left again, because somebody had to feed the cattle, and because the ledgers were sitting on his kitchen table, and because nobody else in this family could read his shorthand but me. The valley didn't want me back. Willow Creek is the kind of place where everyone knows whose granddaughter you are before they know your name, and what they knew about me was that I'd been gone 11 years, that I wore city boots the first winter I was back, and that I inherited land 3 men in this valley had tried to buy from my grandfather at least once. Hollis Byrne, who ran 400 head on the property bordering mine to the north, told the woman at the diner counter that I'd sell within a year because girls like her don't stay. I heard about it the same day, the way you hear everything in a town of 1,100 people. I didn't answer him. I never answer the first time. My grandfather's rule, written on the inside cover of the 1979 ledger in block letters, say it once. If they didn't hear it, that's theirs to carry, not yours. Dale Caldwell showed up on a Thursday in February, 8 weeks after the funeral, driving a white pickup so clean it looked like it had never touched the gravel road it came in on. He introduced himself as Regional Acquisitions Director for Meridian AgroWorks, and he said the word opportunity 4 times in the first 2 minutes. Meridian wanted the water rights attached to my land, senior rights dating to 1911, older than almost anything else on the Willow Creek system, to feed a lithium brine extraction pilot 11 miles upstream, the kind of project that needs more water than the whole valley uses for wheat in a bad year. He offered $2.1 million for the deed, and the rights together, told me it was generous, given the market, and looked at my grandfather's collapsing equipment shed, like he was already picturing the demolition crew. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled the way men like that smile when they've already decided you're going to fold, and said he'd be back in 90 days with paperwork ready to sign. 90 days, like it was a favor. Like patience was something he was extending to me, instead of something he was using as a leash. I opened the 1974 ledger that night, the oldest one, the one with the cracked spine, and read until 2 in the morning by the light over the kitchen table where he used to sit. Page after page of rainfall totals, soil temperature readings taken with a meat thermometer he never replaced, and then, buried in an entry from August of 1976, a line that stopped me cold. Ran tilapia through the west ditch after the well went bad. Nitrogen back inside 4 months. Wheat came in heavier than the year before the well failed. Nobody believed it. Didn't tell anybody twice. 4 sentences. No explanation of how, no diagram, nothing sentimental. Just a man recording what happened the one time he tried something the rest of the valley would have called insane. I read it 3 more times. Then I found the phone number of a hatchery 2 counties over that still raised tilapia for aquaculture stock, and I ordered 2,000 fish with money I didn't have to spare, using the last $11,000 from my grandfather's account after the funeral costs and the back taxes were paid. The truck came on a Tuesday in March, a stock trailer converted with aerated tanks, driven by a hatchery worker who looked at my ditches, looked at me, and asked twice if I was sure. I was sure. I stood in 4 inches of March mud in my grandfather's old canvas coat and released 2,000 live tilapia into the west irrigation ditch myself, wading in boots that filled with cold water within the first 10 minutes, because I wasn't going to ask anyone in this valley for help with something they'd already decided was foolish. The fish scattered into the current, flashes of silver gray under brown water, and the smell of wet earth and fish, and the diesel off the trailer's idling engine, is a smell I can still call up exactly 3 years later, whenever I need to remember why I didn't listen to Roy Fenwick. Roy Fenwick came out 4 days later, uninvited, because word travels fast in a valley this small, and somebody had already called the extension office to report the fish thing. He stood at the edge of the ditch in his county-issued windbreaker, clipboard in hand, and told me, in front of Hollis Byrne, who'd conveniently driven over to watch, that there was no peer-reviewed study supporting aquatic nitrogen cycling in open irrigation systems at this scale, that I was likely introducing an invasive species risk, and that the Department of Agriculture strongly discouraged unconventional inputs without proper testing. He said unconventional, the way other men say a curse word. I told him the fish were contained by the check dams at both ends of the ditch, and that I'd welcome him back to look at soil samples in a year. He said he doubted there'd be anything left to sample. Hollis laughed behind him, the same laugh from the diner. I didn't answer either of them. I wrote the date in the ledger that night, March 14th, 2022. Fenwick visit, no data offered, opinion only. My grandfather taught me that too. When a man gives you his opinion instead of his data, write down the date and wait. The second corporate visit came in May, not from Caldwell but from a Meridian attorney named Vance Pretty, 30 years old at most, sent to clarify the terms after I hadn't called back by the 60-day mark. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table, in a suit that didn't belong within 40 miles of this valley, and told me that senior water rights unused for irrigation could, under certain interpretations of state code, be subject to forfeiture review, and that Meridian would hate to see that happen to a family asset before the sale went through. It was a threat dressed as concern, and I recognized the dressing because I'd spent 11 years in Boise writing briefs that used exactly that kind of language. I told him I was actively irrigating the full 340 acres, that the county had my water use records on file, and that he was welcome to request them himself. He left without the coffee I hadn't offered him. I wrote his name in the ledger too, under a new heading I started that spring, Those Who Came to Fix What Wasn't Broken. By July, the West Field told a different story than anyone expected, including me. The wheat along the tilapia ditch stood 8 inches taller than the wheat 200 yards north, fed by the same aquifer, same seed, same planting date. The soil under it, when I pushed my hand into it past the wrist, the way my grandfather used to, held together in a way it hadn't the year before. Darker, looser, alive with earthworm activity I hadn't seen since I was a kid, running barefoot through these same rows. I didn't tell anyone. My grandfather's rule again. Don't announce a thing until it can defend itself. I kept the ledger updated every Sunday night, kept irrigating on the same 18-day rotation he'd used for 2 decades, and kept my mouth shut through 2 more run-ins with Hollis Byrne at the co-op, where he asked, loud enough for the room, whether I'd started naming my fish yet. If you've made it this far, you already know what it feels like to build something quietly while people wait for you to fail out loud. So hit subscribe now, because the valley was about to find out exactly how wrong it had been, and you're going to want to see it happen in real time. The drought arrived in the summer of 2023, and it didn't arrive gently. The Willow Creek Basin recorded its lowest snowpack in 38 years that winter, and by June, the senior water rights holders upstream of me began cutting allocations to everyone downstream by 40%. Hollis Burns Wells, drilled deep into an aquifer that had never failed him, started pulling silt by July. 2 other ranches along the creek fallowed half their acreage rather than watch it die slow. Roy Fenwick's own department issued an emergency bulletin recommending growers reduce irrigation cycles and brace for yield losses between 30 and 50% across the county. My grandfather's ledgers from the 1977 drought, the worst on record before this one, had a single line I'd underlined that spring without knowing why yet: water holds where the soil holds it. Fix the soil, the water takes care of itself. I hadn't added a single new tilapia since that first release in 2022. I didn't need to. The fish had done their work in the ditch sediment, and the nitrogen and microbial life they'd left behind had built a soil structure that held moisture the way a sponge holds water, instead of the way sand lets it run straight through. My irrigation needs that summer dropped by nearly a third compared to the year before, not because I used less water on purpose, but because the ground finally stopped wasting what it was given. I drove the county road that August and counted 7 fields gone the color of straw before I hit the 2nd-mile marker, cracked earth wide enough to lose a boot heel in, cattle standing bunched under the one cottonwood tree that still threw shade, and then my own west field, green enough at the edges that a stranger passing through might have thought the drought had skipped this one stretch of the valley entirely by accident. It hadn't skipped anything. It had simply run into soil that had learned, over 18 months, how to hold on to what it was given, instead of letting it drain straight through to the water table, the way my neighbor's untreated ground always had. There's a particular sound the west ditch made that first summer, once the tilapia settled into it, a faint, constant ripple against the check dam boards, different from the flat silence of the other ditches, and I found myself walking out there most evenings just to listen to it, the way you'd check on something living because you weren't sure yet whether it would make it through the night. The water carried a mineral smell by June, not unpleasant, closer to a creek bed after rain than anything a fertilizer bag ever smelled like, and some mornings I'd find heron tracks pressed into the mud at the ditch's edge, proof that something in the valley besides me had noticed the water had changed. I kept a separate page in the ledger just for that ditch. Dated entries every Sunday, water temperature, fish activity, sediment color, because my grandfather taught me that the things worth trusting are the things you're willing to write down even when nobody's asking you to. By August, the wheat on my 340 acres was standing at 4'2" on average across every field, drought year or not, while the county average sat closer to 2'9". Hollis Burn cut his herd by 60 head that August, because his hay yield came in at half of a normal year. I didn't say a word to him at the co-op. I didn't have to. He stopped bringing up the fish. The silence from him told me more than any apology would have. I remember standing in the west field at dusk that month, running my palm across the heads of wheat, feeling the weight of the grain against my skin, and thinking about my grandfather's hand on that gear shift, and for the first time since October of 2021, I let myself cry, once, alone, at the fence line, 5 minutes, no witnesses, the way he would have wanted it done if he'd ever admitted to doing it himself. Then I wiped my face on my sleeve and went back to the house and wrote the yield numbers in the ledger, because grief doesn't get to slow down the harvest. Dale Caldwell came back in September of 2023, 18 months after his first 90-day deadline. And this time, he didn't park the clean white truck at the gate. He parked it in the driveway, and he came without an appointment, which told me before he said a single word that something upstream had gone wrong for him. It had. The lithium pilot project 11 miles up the valley had been throttled to a fraction of its planned output because the same drought-crushing Hollis Burns wells had crushed Meridian's projected water allocation too. Their engineers had modeled the extraction against a normal snowpack year, and 2023 hadn't given them one. He stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen, and told me Meridian was prepared to revisit the offer on more favorable terms, not to buy me out this time, but to lease water capacity from my rights at a rate that would have made me, on paper, the single largest water lessor in the county. I let him finish. I let the silence sit for longer than was comfortable for him, because I remembered every version of opportunity he'd used on me 18 months earlier, back when I had $11,000 and 2,000 fish and nothing else. I told him I'd think about it, the same 4 words I'd given him the first time, and watched something shift behind his eyes when he realized I meant it exactly the way he'd meant it back then, as a door closing, not opening. The public reckoning didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on the second Saturday of October 2023 at the Willow Creek Grain Cooperative, where every grower in the county brings final yield numbers to be posted on the chalkboard that's hung on that wall since before I was born. It's a ritual older than any of us. You write your bushels per acre next to your name, in chalk, in front of everyone, and the board doesn't lie and it doesn't flatter. I drove the truck in that morning with my grandfather's ledger on the passenger seat, the newest one, the one I'd filled myself, and I walked up to that board in front of maybe 60 people, including Roy Fenwick with his clipboard, including Hollis Byrne, including Vance Priddy, who Meridian had sent to observe the co-op's regional numbers for their own reporting, and I wrote, Whitfield, 61 BU-acre. The county average posted that same morning, official, from Fenwick's own department, was 34. Someone near the back asked out loud how that was possible in a 50-year drought. Fenwick didn't answer. He was looking at the number like it had personally insulted him. Dale Caldwell was there too, not by accident. He'd asked to attend after our September conversation, and I'd let him, because I wanted him standing in that room when it happened, instead of hearing about it secondhand. He watched 61 go up on that board, watched the room go quiet the way a room goes quiet when it realizes it owes somebody an apology it isn't sure how to give. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the front of the room, set the ledger down on the counter next to the chalkboard, opened to the August entries, soil moisture readings taken twice a week for 18 months, and I said exactly one thing, quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear it. My grandfather wrote 4 sentences about this in 1976. Nobody believed him either. I didn't tell you twice because you didn't listen the first time. Then I closed the ledger and I left the counter to anyone who wanted to look at it, and I walked out to my truck without waiting for a response, because my grandfather's rule was never about winning the room. It was about not needing the room to be won. Fenwick tried to request an official soil study 2 weeks later, citing public interest in replicable results, and I let his own department run it, on my terms, on my schedule, in the spring. The results confirmed nitrogen levels 40% above regional baseline and moisture retention capacity nearly double the county average in the treated ditch zones. He submitted the report to the state without ever once using the word sorry, but he also never laughed at another rancher's methods in that feed store again, not where I could hear about it, and that was its own kind of apology, the only kind men like Fenwick know how to give. Hollis Byrne came to my fence line in November, alone, without an audience for the first time since I'd moved back, and asked, plainly, how I'd done it. I told him what my grandfather told me. Watch the land the way you'd watch a person you were trying to understand, not the way you'd watch a number you were trying to hit. I gave him 200 tilapia from a hatchery order I'd since scaled up, no charge, and told him to keep his own notes, because copying mine wouldn't teach him anything his own ditch couldn't teach him faster. He sold off 40 of his weakest cattle that winter, to cover feed costs from the drought, something I noted in the ledger without comment, because noting it was enough. I didn't need to say it to his face. Meridian AgroWorks came back one final time in February of 2024, and this time it wasn't Caldwell alone in the driveway. It was Caldwell and 2 engineers and a regional vice president named Sandra Okafor, who'd flown in from the company's Denver office specifically for this meeting, because the Lithium Pilots Board had run its own numbers and concluded that leasing stabilized water capacity from a source that didn't collapse in drought years was worth more to their 5-year projections than any outright purchase of my deed had ever been. They sat at my kitchen table, 4 of them this time, and Caldwell, the same man who'd told me 2 years earlier that $2.1 million was generous given the market, slid across a lease proposal worth 4 times that figure over a decade, plus infrastructure investment in my irrigation system that I hadn't asked for and didn't strictly need. I read every page. I didn't smile. I told them I'd agree to a lease, not a sale, that the deed stayed mine, that the ledgers stayed mine, that I'd dictate the irrigation rotation, and they'd build their extraction schedule around my planting calendar, and not the other way around, and that the contract would include a clause allowing me to walk away with full compensation if a single one of their engineers touched the west ditch without my sign-off. Caldwell looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at me and said, "Those are unusual terms." I told her they were the only terms on the table. She signed 6 weeks later. I never raised my voice once across either meeting, because I never needed to. The number on that chalkboard had already said everything I would have had to shout. I remember the exact weight of the pen Okafor handed me across that kitchen table, heavier than it needed to be. The kind of pen a company buys specifically to make a signature feel like an occasion, and I remember thinking of the ballpoint my grandfather kept clipped inside the 1974 ledger, cracked plastic, refilled twice that I knew of, that had recorded every true thing that mattered on this land for half a century. I signed with his pen instead. Caldwell didn't say anything about it. I don't think he even noticed, but I noticed, and I wrote the date next to it that night, because some victories are only real once you've written them down in the same hand that taught you how to win them quietly, in ink that had already survived one drought, one funeral, and 11 years of a valley waiting to be proven right, about a woman who'd never once raised her voice to earn any of it. It's 2034 now, 11 years past that drought, 13 since I buried my grandfather in the same soil that eventually proved him right, in front of the whole valley. The lease with Meridian renewed twice on my terms, and the water capacity I manage funds nearly a third of what's now a 410-acre operation, expanded with land I bought back from 2 ranchers who left the valley for good rather than adapt. Hollis Byrne isn't one of them. He still runs cattle 200 yards north of my fence line, and every spring for the last 9 years he's driven over with his own dented ledger to compare notes on nitrogen readings. And I let him, because a man who finally learns to watch the land instead of laugh at it has earned that much. Roy Fenwick retired from the Extension Office in 2029, the last soil bulletin he ever published. 3 months before he left, cited my ditch data as a regional case study without ever using my name, and I let that go too, because some men can only apologize in footnotes, and I stopped needing more than that a long time ago. Dale Caldwell left Meridian AgroWorks for a competitor in 2031, and the last time our paths crossed, at a regional water rights conference in Boise where I was invited to speak, he introduced himself to a room of 40 people as someone who'd known me since the beginning of the project, which is one way, I suppose, of saying he once stood in my kitchen and offered me $2 million to leave. Vance Pretty sent me a card 2 Christmases ago. I didn't answer it, and I didn't need to write that down anywhere for it to mean something. My grandniece, Reese, is 19 now, finishing her 2nd year at the ag school in Corvallis, and last month, for the first time, I handed her the newest ledger, not the 1974 one, that one stays in a fireproof box, but the current one, spine still stiff, half the pages still blank, and told her the only rule that mattered: write down what happens, not what you feel about it, and don't announce anything until it can defend itself. She asked me if I was scared, handing over decades of proof to someone who hadn't earned the scars that came with it. I told her the ledger was never the proof. The land was the proof. The ledger was just how you remembered to keep watching it. My grandfather taught me that a man's word only means something if he never has to repeat it, and 13 years later, standing at the same fence line where I buried the only tears I let myself have, I think the real inheritance was never the 340 acres or the 11 leather books. It was learning to let the results speak once, clearly, and trusting that once would be enough. What would you have done in that first winter, with a dead man's handwriting and a valley waiting for you to fail? Because next week, I'm telling you what happened the year the fish died. Every single one of them, all at once, and what that silence in the ditch almost cost me, before it taught me the one lesson my grandfather never wrote down. You've already sat through the drought, the boardroom, the chalkboard. You already know you want to see how close I came to losing it all. So don't just scroll past this one. Subscribe now, because you've already proven you're the kind of person who finishes what they start watching.